Yul Brynner stood at attention beside the commissary lunch counter at MGM Studios, observing George C. Scott's increasingly loud dissertation about military authenticity in Hollywood westerns to a captive audience of extras and junior actors who had never witnessed genuine command presence beyond theatrical approximations that most performers employed when portraying authority figures. Knowing that some lectures about authentic leadership were destined to reveal the vast difference between studied military bearing and genuine discipline that had been forged through experiences where following orders meant survival rather than convincing performance for audiences who November 1965, 12:15 in the afternoon, when California's sun created harsh shadows through commissary windows that illuminated dust particles dancing around Scott's gesticulating hands like witnesses to encounters that would separate theoretical knowledge from practical capability, and Hollywood's most convincing military actor was about to discover why Circus discipline produced command presence that West Point training couldn't match when authentic authority met manufactured competence in the most devastating 30 seconds of his legendary career. If you're fascinated by untold stories where Hollywood's most authoritative performers learned brutal lessons about the difference between studied military bearing and genuine discipline forged through survival experiences that most actors couldn't survive, subscribe for more hidden encounters where carefully constructed reputations met capabilities that could reduce commanding officers to crawling when circumstances demanded immediate education about authentic versus theatrical authority. The MGM commissary represented neutral territory where performers from different productions gathered during lunch breaks to share industry gossip and professional observations in an atmosphere that encouraged casual conversation revealing true personalities beneath carefully managed public images. Though the studio's legendary hierarchy meant that established stars could dominate discussions through force of reputation and projected authority, George C. Scott commanded his corner table with natural authority that had made him Hollywood's most convincing military officer, his bearing and vocal delivery creating an atmosphere where everyone present felt they were receiving instruction from someone whose qualifications extended beyond normal acting requirements into territory where authentic leadership experience provided insights that most performers could only approximate through careful study. At 43 years old, Scott possessed commanding presence that made audiences believe they were witnessing genuine military authority rather than theatrical approximation, his performances in war films having established him as the industry's most credible portrayal of officers whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations through combinations of natural leadership ability, intensive preparation, and dramatic instincts. His current monologue focused on the inadequacies of foreign actors who attempted to portray American military characters without possessing the cultural background or authentic understanding of what genuine command authority actually required when circumstances moved beyond scripted scenarios into territory where real leadership was measured through methods that most entertainers never encountered. The problem with casting these exotic foreigners in military roles, Scott explained with authority built on decades of convincing performances, is that they lack fundamental understanding of what authentic command presence requires when you're dealing with real soldiers who can distinguish between genuine authority and theatrical approximation designed to impress civilians. His analysis was delivered with confident certainty that impressed listeners who lacked sufficient background to distinguish between theoretical knowledge and practical experience with military leadership, developed through circumstances where mistakes carried consequences beyond damaged pride. "Take that circus monkey Brynner," Scott continued, his voice gaining volume and contempt as he focused on a specific target whose success in authoritative roles had apparently become a source of professional irritation. Shaves his head, speaks with an accent, and suddenly Hollywood thinks he can portray kings and military leaders, because audiences are impressed by exotic mystique rather than authentic qualifications. The insult was delivered with casual cruelty that characterized men whose professional security drove them to diminish competitors through methods that revealed more about their own limitations than about their targets' supposed inadequacies. "You can teach a circus performer to bark orders and stand straight," Scott declared with satisfaction. "But you can't give him the kind of authentic command presence that comes from men whose leadership capabilities have been tested under circumstances where following orders means the difference between survival and becoming casualties." But what Scott didn't understand was that his educational lecture was being overheard by someone whose background included experiences with genuine authority and discipline that had nothing to do with entertainment applications and everything to do with survival training where following orders wasn't a matter of convincing performance, but of staying alive under circumstances where theatrical approximations couldn't provide authentic leadership. That's when the MGM commissary atmosphere shifted in ways that regular patrons would remember as education about the difference between studied military bearing and genuine discipline, and why certain men commanded universal respect while others demanded recognition through methods that never impressed anyone whose judgment was based on direct observation. Yul approached Scott's table with movements so precise they seemed to follow invisible drill manual specifications, his compact frame radiating disciplined intensity that made everyone suddenly aware they were witnessing an encounter between different philosophies of authority that might not be resolved through diplomatic discussion. "Mr. Scott," Yul said quietly when he reached the table, his accented voice carrying controlled authority that made conversational tone more commanding than shouted orders. "I couldn't help but overhear your analysis of my qualifications for portraying military authority, and I find your assessment both amusing and profoundly ignorant of what constitutes authentic discipline versus studied approximations." The response was delivered without anger, simply professional evaluation from someone whose authority didn't require validation through comparison with others or diminishment of competitors whose success threatened psychological security. Scott looked up with surprise that quickly transformed into aggressive posturing as he realized his educational entertainment was being challenged by someone whose response might exceed normal diplomatic protests, understanding that his audience was now watching to see whether his proclaimed military expertise could withstand contact with opposition. Well, Scott replied with condescending authority. The circus monkey himself decides to join the conversation about military authenticity. "Tell me, Brynner, what exactly qualifies you to evaluate command presence when your background consists of performing for audiences rather than leading men under circumstances where real authority determines whether people live or die?" The challenge was designed to force Yul into either retreat that would validate Scott's assessment or escalation that would provide opportunity to demonstrate military knowledge that Scott's preparation had convinced him could not be matched by someone whose training was presumably limited to entertainment applications. "My qualifications," Yul replied with calm precision, "were developed through circumstances where discipline meant survival rather than convincing performance, and where following orders correctly was the difference between continuing to breathe and becoming educational examples for others whose lives depended on authentic rather than theoretical understanding." The cryptic response carried undertones suggesting experiences beyond normal entertainment industry preparation, though Scott's confidence prevented him from recognizing warning signs that might have been interpreted as reasons to abandon confrontation. "That's a very convenient answer for someone whose military experience probably consists of wearing costumes and following directions from civilian directors," Scott replied with sneering dismissal. "But I know what real military discipline looks like, because I've studied it extensively and portrayed it convincingly for audiences who understand the difference between authentic command presence and circus tricks." The final insult crossed boundaries that demanded response through methods that transcended normal diplomatic solutions and entered territory where authentic authority was demonstrated rather than discussed. What happened next lasted perhaps 20 seconds but would be remembered by everyone present as brutal education about the difference between studied military bearing and genuine discipline. Yul moved with precision that revealed training developed through circumstances where following orders correctly was a matter of survival rather than convincing performance, his response calculated to provide maximum educational impact, while demonstrating the kind of disciplined authority that Scott's theoretical knowledge had never prepared him to encounter. The movement was so swift and controlled that Scott found himself on the commissary floor before his studied military bearing could process what had occurred, his commanding presence completely neutralized by contact with genuine discipline that operated according to principles his entertainment industry preparation had never encountered. But what made the demonstration particularly devastating was that Scott wasn't simply knocked down. He was positioned in a way that required him to crawl across the polished floor to regain his footing, his legendary command presence reduced to the kind of humiliating movement that destroyed any pretense of military authority, while serving as visual reminder of what happened when studied expertise encountered authentic capability. "Mr. Scott," Yul said quietly as the future Patton star struggled to maintain dignity while crawling toward a position where he might recover some semblance of commanding presence, his voice carrying controlled authority that made whispered instruction more devastating than shouted commands. Authentic military discipline doesn't require insulting others to maintain its authority, and real command presence operates through demonstrated competence rather than studied approximations. The assessment was delivered without malice, simply professional evaluation from someone whose authority had just been established through direct demonstration rather than verbal assertion that could be questioned when circumstances revealed limitations underlying carefully constructed expertise. Scott's crawling movement across the commissary floor created complete silence as everyone present processed the implications of witnessing Hollywood's most convincing military officer reduced to undignified positioning that destroyed any pretense of command authority while serving as permanent reminder of what happened when theoretical knowledge encountered practical capability. The humiliation was complete and devastating, not because of physical injury, but because Scott's entire professional identity was based on projecting authentic military bearing that commanded respect through presence alone, and having that carefully constructed authority reduced to crawling movement in front of industry colleagues meant that no amount of subsequent explanation could rehabilitate the image of competence that had just been demolished. I suggest you consider whether your studied expertise provides adequate preparation for evaluating men whose qualifications were developed through circumstances where discipline served purposes beyond entertainment value. Yul continued with gentle precision that carried more authority than dramatic declarations could achieve. Years later, when asked about memorable encounters with fellow actors whose capabilities had exceeded his initial assessment, Scott would describe his interaction with Yul Brynner as professionally instructive, though he never provided specific details about what had occurred in the MGM commissary or why his subsequent criticisms of foreign actors had become notably more circumspect. I learned that there are different types of discipline, and recognizing the difference between what you think you understand and what others have actually experienced is essential for maintaining realistic assessment of your own qualifications. Scott would tell interviewers curious about his evolving perspective on authentic military bearing versus entertainment industry approximations. The psychological impact of being reduced to crawling across a studio commissary floor in front of industry colleagues whose opinions affected his professional reputation would resonate through Scott's career in ways that no amount of subsequent military preparation could completely overcome. The commanding officer who had never been challenged in his expertise had discovered that Hollywood contained men whose qualifications extended beyond theoretical knowledge into territory where genuine authority could demonstrate its superiority through methods that left permanent reminders about the difference between studied and authentic capability. Industry insiders who had witnessed the MGM encounter began sharing carefully edited versions of the story that emphasized the importance of professional respect while omitting the specific details of how Scott's condescending lecture about military authenticity had been addressed through methods that transformed Hollywood's most convincing general into a crawling figure whose dignity required reconstruction from the ground up, literally and figuratively. The image of Scott crawling across the polished commissary floor would never completely fade from the memory of those who had observed his systematic reduction from commanding presence to humiliated movement that destroyed any pretense of military superiority, while serving as visual confirmation that authentic discipline operated according to principles that theatrical expertise couldn't challenge without facing consequences that extended far beyond wounded professional pride. Directors who worked with Scott on subsequent military films noted that his approach to interactions with foreign actors had become notably more diplomatic, as though the experience of being literally brought to his knees by someone whose background he had dismissed as inadequate had taught him that expertise could be measured through standards that academic preparation couldn't duplicate when tested against opposition, whose qualifications had been earned through circumstances that entertainment industry training couldn't replicate. The commissary incident would become legend within industry circles, though both men maintained professional courtesy in subsequent interactions that suggested mutual understanding about boundaries that had been established through methods that transcended normal entertainment industry protocols and entered territory where genuine respect was earned through demonstrated competence rather than demanded through position or reputation. But those who witnessed the MGM encounter understood they had seen something that revealed fundamental truths about the difference between studied expertise and authentic capability, and why certain demonstrations left permanent impressions that affected all subsequent interactions between men whose authority had been earned through methods that most people couldn't survive and wouldn't want to attempt under circumstances that offered alternatives to challenges that tested human limitations beyond normal boundaries that civilized society had established to protect people from experiences that shaped character through methods that entertained